Welcome to Muscular Minds Podcast, where we want to build mental toughness and resilience for you, your family, your faith, and your future. Thanks for joining us today.
All right, welcome to Muscular Minds. This is your host, Jared Dane, and our podcast today, as you know, is about things that make us tougher, fitter, more resilient, and we look at all kinds of ways to do that. We talk to coaches and trainers and doctors and superintendents, and today we have a chaplain who really goes around encouraging other people in their faith, and we're going to hear a little bit more about that, but I'm excited to have chaplain Matt here today. And so, Matt, why don't you just start us off? Tell us what a chaplain is. What do they do?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Jared. Chaplains are everywhere. They're in all kinds of settings, workplace, prisons, hospitals, hospice, military, you name it. We are everywhere because ministry is needed everywhere. So we go where the need is. And we're on the front lines of spiritual care. We partner with people that of all faiths and traditions, and even those that don't have or profess a faith, to be there for them in their time of vulnerability and when things are hardest for them. So we are a lot of times that spiritual comfort that you are in desperate need of in that moment of adversity. We come alongside you and companion with you and help you ask and even maybe try to answer some of those very hard questions that life can throw at us in those really critical moments of our lives when we're searching, frankly, and we're grasping at straws and we're at the end of ourselves. And that's where a chaplain can come alongside us and make it not feel so scary and lonely. And we're there to help do that.
So one of the things that I was reading up on, I was looking at some research. Pew Research was talking about how the most popular religion is basically none, not one. So Americans don't really subscribe to religion. Maybe they did like they did in the past 20 years ago. And so what is your thought about maybe why Americans are not people of faith anymore? Why that is something that they don't incorporate into themselves maybe as they did in the past?
Well, like a lot of things, that might not be entirely true. I think we are people of faith. We're just putting it in different things. Organized religion is kind of been battered probably the last few decades. People don't trust it for good reason sometimes. They're just aligning themselves with different ways of expressing their spirituality. So we are very spiritual. If you look at as a people, there's a lot of people that want spiritual connection. They're just getting it in different ways than the traditional means of going to a church or a mosque or a temple and finding it with a particular faith group or a tradition.
I like that. So I feel when I hear that, hey, it's not that we've abandoned our faith. It's maybe turned into something else. It's been refocused somewhere else, and we've lost maybe our trust in those human institutions. But yet the thing that drives us from a spiritual standpoint is still there. It just may have to be harnessed in a different way. Is there something that you think maybe that we can do that would help us recapture some of the community that we get when we express our faith? Because I know that's been a big part of when I grew up and my family, grandparents, like we did things together that had a spiritual emphasis, whether that was something in the community like church or whatever. Is there a way to recapture a little bit of that community that you get with your spiritual walk sometimes instead of just doing it alone?
I mean, there's two kinds of parts of your spiritual life, isn't it? There's the vertical, right? And then there's the horizontal, which is belonging, togetherness. And then there's your journey with you and the divine, however you see that. So both of them are needed, right? A lot of times we're good at doing this. A lot of people do that one-on-one with meditation, mindfulness, but you still are missing a component if you don't connect that somehow to another person of like faith or even different faith, or just someone that you can talk to and be in community with. So it's going to be interesting as a country how we identify how we gather together going forward, because we are rapidly changing and the usual places are not working. So do we go online to find that? Do we find groups underground, as it were. I don't know. It's kind of we're in this betwixt and between place. And I think the next 20 years are going to be really interesting. And chaplains are in a really advantageous position, because where a lot of people won't trust preachers or normal traditional outlets, they will talk to a chaplain because they see us as kind of a non-threatening entity, as someone that doesn't have a rooting interest and is just there to listen and to provide support.
Kind of a neutral party in the group.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
And I like what you said too, that it is changing, it's shifting. Do we look for our community online? How are we going to do this? Because I do think, as much as you say, we are focused so at times on the vertical and we kind of forget about the horizontal. And I noticed that people will do the vertical part. Maybe they just do stream a worship in their house, and then they do the horizontal is community with other people, other places, but it's not necessarily a spiritual intent. And so I guess I'm just curious sometimes, how are we going to figure out how to do that moving forward, spiritual and community, because it does require what you say, that horizontal piece, to be with other people. So I think you have a good point when you say that.
I just
Maybe help me
answer
go
Can I
ahead.
answer? Yeah, I was just going to answer your question a little more fully, because I think what you're trying to get at is like, how do we imagine spiritual togetherness? How are we going to envision that? If the normal structures break down, how do we reimagine that? Because we all want to belong. We all have a need to connect. So we're going to have to reimagine, and it's going to take some envisioning. And some resiliency spiritually to wander outside of normal comfort zones and express ourselves with people that we may never have sought out in another time and place. And so it's going to be a lot of growing pains, I think, are in store for us, but I think a lot of opportunities too, for those of us that are willing to kind of come outside of our traditional spaces and say, I'll meet you out here. I'm not sure where we're going, but we'll see what we can do together.
Yeah. So some flexibility, some willingness to kind of like do something that maybe even be uncomfortable. So I think that's good, but just an openness. Maybe you could, I know you do specifically hospice chaplaincy. Maybe explain how that's different than is it maybe how somebody might just originally think about what a chaplain does. What's hospice chaplaincy specifically? What is it you do?
Well, I like to think of what we do as meeting people. Ministry, any kind, is meeting people where they are. And so hospice is meeting them at the end of their life. They're on the last leg of their journey, the last mile of the race. And that can be the hardest one sometimes, where you have the most doubt about how you've lived your life. Maybe what you've put your stock in is not giving you a return anymore. You're realizing there's end. You don't have decades and decades of life ahead of you, so you're having to make preparations. You're having finality and a mortality. You're looking at your own mortality, and that can create a faith crisis. It can create a resiliency crisis and a crisis of all sorts, of how you see and believe. And so faith is the evidence of things unseen. So you're having to test that faith, because all that is about ready to come to fruition. And so what you believe matters a great deal at the end of life. And it's very palpable, and almost where you can see it for some people. And literally some people do see it and tell me about it. And that's interesting. And I find that fascinating to listen to them tell me that they've seen the other side, and they're kind of talking about it, because for those people, they've got one foot in that place, in that eternal place, that next way that we're going to exist, whatever that looks like. So yes, hospice chaplains deal with the I guess death and dying, but I like to look at it as a way that we live, and way of living well at the end, and helping people do that with dignity, with respect and honor, and with a sense of purpose and meaning. And we help hopefully add value to all of that for them at the end of their life.
I'm sure that, when you're dealing with somebody that's towards the end, it's kind of a sacred space with people, the people are really raw at that point. Sometimes it's very challenging for them or even traumatic. What are the kinds of things that people share at the end of their time that like might be insightful for the rest of us to kind of understand, or as if we can grow and kind of gain a sense of like how our faith could even be strengthened in these kind of end of life moments and situations? What kind of things are you hearing from people that kind of encourage you that you could share with us?
How much time you got?
Right?
I've got stories. We could go on for a couple hours and they'd be fascinating to your audience to hear even maybe a couple of them. I'll try to share if we have time, but really probably the biggest takeaway is that the world that we can't see is as real or more real really than the world that we can see. And that when you're at the end of your life, sometimes are privileged with the opportunity of seeing behind the veil. If you get to see the wizard, if you've those that have seen the Wizard of Oz, you get to look behind the veil and see the wizard. Some people actually have extraordinary experiences that they can share. And it's a real gift and blessing to those of us on this side to hear that there is something on the other side, something wonderful and beautiful that awaits us, that it's not scary, it's not lonely, it doesn't have to be those things, and we don't have to fear death and run away from it, that actually it's a part of life. Death is a part of life and into another life that is more full even than this one. And I think there's a lot of things to put your faith in. And so we don't have to walk around without our faith. We can very much put our faith in those things that are unseen. As a supervisor of mine said once, he says, a lot of times we live our lives saying, seeing is believing, right? We've all heard that one. And he would tell us believing is seeing. When you believe in something, you start seeing things a lot different.
I like that. Well, I do think we may have to have you back on another podcast and get into some of these kind of insights into to the other side. I think that'd be really good. I certainly am intrigued by hearing some of that. I do kind of want to bring it to a lot of people, and specifically this podcast, we talk about resiliency and mental confidence. And how do you see people's faith intersect their mental fitness, their mental health? Do those two things go together, or are they divorced from each other? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, of course not. We're a whole person, right? But when we're physically hurting, spiritually, we're probably not doing too well because we're so focused on our body that our spirit is in distress too. It's when our body is at peace, then our spirit can be at peace. So none of these things happen in isolation. I think that's a big misnomer that we kind of think, I got my mind over here, my body over here, my spirit over there, and none of them shall meet. They all are interconnected. And I think, one of the things that we actually try to measure is spiritual distress and moral distress. Just a very quick example, just a general example, a veteran, say, has guilt for killing in a war that happened 40 years ago. He's still carrying it around today. How do we help him unburden himself? Mentally, he's in anguish about it, and spiritually, he's suffering for it. And it's allowing him not to die peacefully or in a comfortable way, and is to the point where his body is having psychological and physical symptoms. And so, we have to address all those pieces. The whole team does that. We need the medication, we need the counseling, we need the spiritual parts. So yes, there is a spiritual component that people a lot of times leave out when they're doing all these other mental, muscular mind things. But I would encourage them, to exercise your spiritual life as well. Have one and try to stick to a plan with it, because it will help you in those moments to get through things, because sometimes we can't do this alone and we need help. And like that soldier, he needed help to get through that. That's not something you can do alone.
I like that. And I think what you're saying, we don't do it alone. And that our faith, we're a whole person. And I think, unfortunately, we like to peel off layers, right? We have our person that handles our physical well-being, our doctor. We have, our psychologist person that's going to handle the mental health. And then we have our chaplain that's going to do the spiritual health. But sometimes there's not a lot of overlap that happens, and I think sometimes even we might say, oh, well, this one's important, but these two aren't, or these two are important, but this one's not. And I think we don't realize, hey, these things go together. And when one is hurting, it affects the other two. And so sometimes we have to pay attention to how they are affecting one another. So I think that's really good. I like that. Do you run into people that try to, maybe they're not a person of faith and they don't see the benefit of engaging their spiritual self or any kind of faith in anything? How do you approach someone like that, especially if they're
Well, sometimes they may not see me, and that's okay. They may say no to a chaplain, and that's within their prerogative. You do not have to have a chaplain. I don't see everybody that we have on our services. I see about half of them. And I hope that The other half that I don't see is getting their spiritual needs met somehow. Honestly, I know that's not the case, but everybody has a right to self-determination, and that includes their spiritual care that they choose to take or not take. A lot of times we probably have had a bad experience with a preacher or in the past, and that may be affecting our judgment, or we just aren't ready to have those tough conversations, and a chaplain is a reminder of that, which we don't want to talk about yet. And I would just say it's okay you don't have to be scared of those things. It's just part of the process of talking and trying to unravel the mysteries of life, which are difficult. And I'd say, let me in the conversation. We're not there to judge. And I think that's probably the biggest thing that people kind of get hung up on, is that we're there to tell you that, you can't do this and you can't do that, or this is this. And people have guilt, and there's just a lot of baggage. And so sometimes the chaplain has to say, I'm not any of those things. I'm just here to be a support to you. A chaplain is a minister of presence. I definitely want to say that. That doesn't mean that he's a bump on a log and he's just present, like giving roll call. It's an art. Walking into a room where you can feel the tension, or the time does not speak, and then there's a time to speak, like the Ecclesiastes Solomon told us in chapter 3. There's a time for everything, and a chaplain, is walking through artfully, hopefully, those times to speak, when to speak, how to speak, and realizing that there are no sure answers to a lot of the things that he's doing. So he needs to be very comfortable with not having the answers, and being very comfortable with saying, I don't know. And saying, you know what, maybe we can both not know together, and hopefully come to a little bit better understanding, and take one step forward, maybe toward knowing a little bit more. But if a chaplain is coming to you with all the answers, you need to send him away, because he's not doing his job very well at that point. There's part of the mystery of spirituality is like it is a mystery. Some of it we get to see and unravel like an onion. We get to peel it away, but there's always a bunch of other that we don't get to peel under that onion. There's always more layers that we never get to. So I would say, let the chaplain help. Let him come alongside you and be a participant in your walk. Hopefully, he or she will do a good job helping you claim some of your faith, and even your faith in humanity, and maybe a higher power, what that is for you, and let you not feel so alone, and realize that these are questions that we all struggle with and deal with. And at the end of life, especially our mortality is, we're bumping up against it, that, we can have a little more peace in our hearts when we get to that place where we can say, yeah, I've done well, and I've lived well, and I can die well too. This doesn't have to be scary. It can be good, and it can have quality, and it can have meaning, and it can be with people I care about.
I like that. Well, I appreciate it, Chaplain Matt, for hopping on with us today and discussing how our spiritual health and fitness can definitely help us be more resilient, more confident, and especially in our end of life challenges that we face, because we're all going to be there. Obviously, we're not going to live forever. So being able to glean some wisdom today from you as far as how you walk with people in those end of life moments, we appreciate you hopping on and doing that for us today. And we hope you have it back another time. But thank you for being here with Muscular Minds, and we'll catch you next time.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining Muscular Minds today, where strength isn't measured by how much you lift, but who you lift up. And that starts with you.